This helicopter is a scrap. No one in the world can fix this.
Oh, but I can fix it in just 3 minutes.
47 experts, 11 months, $2,300,000 in diagnostic fees, labor costs, replacement parts, and specialist consultations from 5 different countries. And the helicopter sat there dead, silent, humiliating on the rooftop helipad of the Callaway Tower in downtown Chicago, covered in a tarp that had begun to look less like a protective measure and more like a burial shroud. 11 months. That's how long it had been since the most advanced private helicopter money could buy had simply stopped. Without warning. Without explanation. Without the decency of a clear error code or a traceable fault or anything that the 47 specialists who had subsequently touched it could point to and say, "There. That's the problem. We can fix that." 47 people. 11 months. $2.3 million. And on a Tuesday morning in October, a man in a canvas work jacket with a thermos of coffee and a 7-year-old girl sitting on a toolbox fixed it. In 3 minutes. Not 3 hours. Not 3 days. 3 minutes. What happened in those 3 minutes and what happened before them, and what came after, is the kind of story that sounds impossible until you know everything. And once you know everything, it doesn't sound impossible at all. It sounds like exactly what was always going to happen. Because the man who fixed that helicopter in 3 minutes wasn't lucky. He wasn't showing off. He had known for 11 months exactly what was wrong. Nobody had thought to ask him. The helicopter was a Sikorsky S-92. Not a standard one. There was no such thing as a standard one when you were Richard Callaway, yes. Related to the Preston Callaway from Savannah. The same family, different branch. The Chicago money versus the Georgia money, which was a distinction that mattered enormously to both of them, and to essentially no one else. Richard was 55, the older cousin, the one who had actually built something from the inheritance, rather than merely expanding it. And he wore this fact with the specific quiet satisfaction of a man who competes with family members in ways they're not aware of. The helicopter had been commissioned at $9.2 million. It had custom avionics, a reinforced airframe rated for extreme weather operations, a passenger cabin that sat 8 in the kind of silence and comfort that made commercial aviation feel like a philosophical error, and a paint job matte charcoal with a single red pinstripe along the fuselage that had been described by a magazine as the kind of restraint that only the truly wealthy can afford. Richard Callaway used it every day. Not occasionally, every day. From the Callaway Tower helipad to O'Hare when he needed to fly commercial, which was rarely to his estate in Lake Forest, to meetings in Milwaukee, to the lake house in Michigan that he used 6 times a year and insisted on reaching by air, because the drive took an hour and 40 minutes, and that was, by his calculation, an hour and 40 minutes of his life that could be spent more productively. The helicopter was not a luxury in the way most people use that word. It was infrastructure. It was how Richard Callaway moved through the world, and the world had arranged itself accordingly. When it stopped working on a Wednesday in November 11 months ago, Richard had initially been unconcerned. Things broke. Things got fixed. He had people for that. He sent the in-house aviation manager, a meticulous man named Gerald Park, 20 years in commercial aviation, who'd worked for Callaway Industries for 6 of them to sort it out. Gerald ran the standard diagnostics. Found nothing. Ran them again. Found nothing. Brought in the authorized Sikorsky service team from their Midwest facility, 4 technicians, who spent 3 days and billed $80,000 and left with a report that Gerald described to Richard as impressively detailed and entirely inconclusive. Richard had still not been particularly alarmed. December passed. Then January. The teams came and went like weather systems, each one arriving with confidence, each one departing with carefully worded reports that meant, underneath the professional language, we looked at everything we know how to look at, and it isn't any of those things. By March, Richard Calloway was alarmed. By May, he was furious. By August, he had spent $2.3 million and was beginning to have a feeling he had not experienced in a very long time. A feeling he did not have good equipment to process because he had spent his entire adult life engineering circumstances that prevented it from arriving. He was stuck. The helicopter sat on the roof under its tarp. Gerald Park had quietly started keeping track of the number of specialists in a spreadsheet that he updated weekly and never showed Richard because the number had become, in Gerald's estimation, the kind of fact that helps no one. Richard had taken to using a car service for the Lake Forest run, which added 47 minutes each way, which he tracked and accumulated mentally the way some people accumulate grievances as a running total, as evidence of something owed. By September, the total stood at 47 specialists and $2.3 million. Gerald's spreadsheet showed 47. Gerald did not show Richard the spreadsheet, but Gerald, who was meticulous, had also done something else. He had read every report, all of them, every page, every appendix, every footnote. He had read them the way a man reads something he suspects contains the answer in a language he doesn't quite speak carefully, repeatedly, hoping that the pattern will surface. And on the 42nd day of this exercise, reading through a report from a team out of Houston, he had found a sentence in a footnote on page 31 that said, in the specific cauterized language of technical documentation, fuel system anomaly possible vapor lock condition, could not replicate under test conditions, recommend further evaluation by specialist with specific rotary wing fuel system experience. Vapor lock. Gerald had looked up vapor lock in the context of helicopter fuel systems. He had found a world of information. He did not fully understand a world of fuel vapor pressure, engine intake temperatures, specific altitude and ambient condition interactions, and a particular quirk of certain Sikorsky configurations where vapor lock could occur under a narrow combination of conditions and then resolve itself, leaving no trace in the diagnostic record because the condition no longer existed when the specialists arrived. Gerald had read all of this and felt the particular loneliness of understanding something without knowing what to do with it. He had written vapor lock, Sikorsky fuel system specialist, in the margin of his notepad. He had not known who to call. He had not known that the person he needed was on the 41st floor of the same building, every Tuesday and Thursday, fixing the HVAC system. His name was Danny Kowalski. He was 39 years old and had the particular physical quality of someone who has spent 2 decades working in mechanical spaces that were not designed for human comfort, not small, exactly, but compact, with a way of moving through the world that was efficient, in the way of someone accustomed to tight tolerances. He had brown hair going gray at the temples, hands that told the whole story of his working life in their calluses and scars, and eyes that noticed things, always noticed things. His daughter, Emma, was 7 years old and had recently decided that the optimal way to spend her days when school was out was in her father's work truck, which she had furnished with a drawing kit, 3 stuffed animals, a blanket, and an organizational system for her snacks that Danny considered more sophisticated than some logistics operations he'd seen. Emma had her father's eyes, the noticing kind, and her late mother's laugh, which arrived suddenly and completely, and made every room feel like a better version of itself. Danny Kowalski was a mechanical systems technician. He worked for a firm called Lakefront Mechanical Services, which handled HVAC, hydraulic systems, pneumatic systems, and mechanical maintenance for a dozen commercial buildings in downtown Chicago, including, since a contract renewal 18 months ago, Callaway Tower. He had not set out to be a mechanical systems technician. He had set out at 17, with a clarity of purpose that most 17-year-olds don't possess to be an aviator. Not a commercial pilot. Military, specifically, the United States Army Aviation Branch, which produces some of the most capable helicopter pilots and aviation mechanics in the world. Danny had enlisted at 18, been selected for aviation training at 20, and had spent 12 years in the Army as a helicopter crew chief and ultimately an aviation warrant officer, a technical specialist with a specific and irreplaceable kind of expertise. He had worked on Black Hawks, Apaches, Chinooks. He had deployed to 2 combat zones, where helicopters were not a convenience, but a lifeline, where the difference between a machine that worked and a machine that didn't was measured not in inconvenience, but in lives. He had crawled through engine bays under fire. He had diagnosed faults in conditions that no service manual anticipated, because service manuals are written in peacetime, and combat has different weather. He had developed, over 12 years, the specific intuition that belongs to people who have learned their discipline under conditions where being wrong has consequences, not just technical knowledge, but something faster and deeper than that. A kind of mechanical sense that operated below conscious thought. The way some people can hear a wrong note in a piece of music before they can name which note it is. He had left the Army 10 years ago. Not because of anything dramatic. His wife, Claire, was pregnant with Emma. Claire had been diagnosed during the pregnancy with a heart condition that required management, monitoring, care, the kind of care that military life with its deployments and relocations made difficult to guarantee. Danny had done the math and made the decision with the same clarity he brought to everything. What mattered most, what the trade-off was, whether he could live with it. He could. He went home. He went to work. He built a life. And then Claire died, not from the heart condition, which had been managed successfully for 3 years, but from a car accident on a Thursday in January when Emma was 4, which is the kind of thing that happens and cannot be prepared for, and that changes the geometry of every subsequent day. Danny raised Emma alone. He cooked her breakfast every morning. She liked scrambled eggs with hot sauce, which he considered advanced taste for a 7-year-old, and supported fully. He took her to school and picked her up and brought her to work on the days when school was out. And he read to her every night. And he coached her soccer team on Saturdays. And he kept a photograph of Claire on the dashboard of the work truck, so that Emma would grow up knowing what her mother's face looked like when she was happy. He had also, every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 11 months, passed through the lobby of Callaway Tower, taken the service elevator to 41, done his work on the HVAC systems, and on his way back down every single time, without fail paused at the 47th floor window that faced the rooftop helipad and looked at the Sikorsky S-92 under its tarp. And known. He had known since the 3rd week. He had been in the service elevator on a Thursday in November, 8 days after the helicopter had first failed, and a building maintenance worker named Phil had mentioned it in passing the CEO's helicopter, the specialists coming and going. Nobody can figure it out. And Danny had asked 2 questions. What were the conditions when it failed? And had anyone checked the fuel system? And Phil had said he didn't know. And Danny had said, mildly, that it sounded like it might be vapor lock in the fuel intake, specific to Sikorsky configurations under certain temperature and altitude conditions, and had thought nothing more of it. He was a building vac technician. Nobody had asked him about helicopters. He had not offered again. The Tuesday it changed started like every other Tuesday. Danny and Emma arrived at Callaway Tower at 7:45. Emma had her drawing kit and her stuffed elephant named Gerald. She had named him Gerald because she had once met Gerald Park in the lobby and found him reassuringly elephantine in his steadiness, which Danny considered both perceptive and slightly unfair to Gerald Park, who was a perfectly proportioned human being. They went up to 41. Danny worked. Emma drew. At 9:30, Danny took his coffee break on the 47th floor landing. He had a standing informal arrangement with the cleaning crew there. who had an excellent coffee machine and a general policy of sharing it with people they liked, and he stood at the window and looked at the helicopter, as he did every Tuesday and Thursday. As he did every Tuesday and Thursday, he thought, vapor lock, Sikorsky fuel system, specific thermal conditions, vapor pressure differential in the intake manifold. Fix takes about 3 minutes once you know what you're looking at. As he did every Tuesday and Thursday, he said nothing. He went back to work. At 11:15, the service elevator opened on 41, and Gerald Park stepped out. Gerald Park was, as noted, a meticulous man. He was also, after 11 months, a quietly desperate one. He had read 47 reports. He had found 1 footnote. He had written 1 note in 1 margin. He had carried that margin note for weeks. And this particular Tuesday morning, after reading a new report from a team flown in from Germany that had arrived that morning, and contained in its summary the words "no fault identified at this time," Gerald Park had taken the elevator to 41 on the chance that the vac technician who had said something about vapor lock to Phil in November might still be the person who came on Tuesdays. Danny looked up from the duct manifold he was servicing. Gerald Park looked at him. "You said something to Phil," Gerald said, "in November, about vapor lock." Danny set down his wrench. He looked at Gerald the way he looked at broken things, calmly, without hurry, taking the measure of what was in front of him. "Yeah," he said. "I need you to come to the roof." The roof of Callaway Tower was 49 floors up. The wind on an October morning in Chicago at that height has a specific quality, clean and relentless, coming off the lake with the cold clarity of water that has traveled a long distance and has nothing to prove. The helipad was surrounded by a low safety railing. The tarp over the S-92 snapped in the wind. Gerald had pulled it back by the time Danny got there. Danny stepped out onto the roof and looked at the Sikorsky. He walked around it once. He did not touch it yet. He looked at it the way he looked at all machines completely, from every angle, taking inventory of everything visible before moving to what wasn't. The helicopter was in good condition externally, well maintained, surfaces clean, rotor assembly correctly secured. Whatever was wrong with it wasn't visible from the outside. Danny crouched at the engine bay access panel. What were the conditions when it failed? He said. Gerald had this memorized. November 3rd, cold morning, 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The pilot ran the pre-flight checks. Everything normal. Engine started, ran to warm up RPM. Then it transitioned to flight power. Gerald checked his notes. Even though he didn't need to, fuel pressure dropped. Engines flamed out. Both simultaneously. Pilot shut down safely. Aircraft has not flown since. Altitude when it failed? On the ground. On this pad. What's the elevation of this pad? Gerald calculated. Building is 602 feet above sea level. The pad adds another 700 feet approximately. And it was 22 degrees. Yes. Danny nodded slowly. Cold, high, dry. Fuel temperature would have been low overnight. When the engines went to full transition power, the fuel draw rate spiked that created a low pressure zone in the intake manifold. In that ambient temperature, the fuel vapor pressure differential, he paused, translating from the technical into something else, the fuel essentially boiled slightly. Just enough. The vapor blocked the fuel flow for a moment. The engine management system read it as a fuel system fault and shut everything down as a failsafe. Gerald stared at him. That's it? That's my read. 47 specialists didn't find they would have arrived after the conditions resolved. Indoor storage, warmer temperatures, different barometric pressure. They ran diagnostics, found clean readings, because the condition wasn't present anymore. Danny paused. It's in the footnote of the Houston team's report. Page 31. Gerald opened his mouth, closed it. He had found that footnote. He had written the margin note. You read the reports? Phil showed them to me in March. I read them. You read 47 technical reports on a helicopter that had nothing to do with your job. I was curious, Danny said simply. It's a beautiful aircraft. The door to the roof stairwell opened. Richard Calloway stepped out. He was not supposed to be there. Gerald had come up quietly, on an instinct, without telling Richard, partly because he didn't want to raise hope unnecessarily, and partly because 11 months of failed specialists had created in Gerald a careful pessimism about the words "I think I know what's wrong." Richard had followed him. He had been on 49, the executive floor, when he'd seen Gerald take the elevator up with a purpose that didn't match his usual Tuesday morning demeanor, and he had taken the stairs because Richard Calloway, when something was happening, had a compulsive need to be present for it. He stepped onto the roof and took in the scene. Gerald Park, the Sikorsky without its tarp, and a man in a canvas work jacket crouched at the engine bay access panel, with a thermos of coffee sitting on the helipad beside him, like he'd come up for a casual look at the view. And next to the thermos, sitting on a toolbox she had apparently carried from somewhere, a small girl in a purple jacket, drawing in a sketchbook, occasionally glancing at the helicopter with the same noticing eyes as her father. Richard looked at Gerald. "Who," he said, "is this?" What followed was the kind of scene that people who were there would describe differently, depending on where they stood. Gerald would later say that Richard's reaction was understandable given 11 months of frustration and $2.3 million and 47 people who'd all had a confident explanation that turned out to be wrong. The building security officer who'd come up with Richard, a man named Torres, who stood 6'2", and had been quietly praying for an uneventful Tuesday, would say that it escalated faster than he'd expected. Danny himself would say, later, with characteristic brevity, that it went about how you'd expect. "This is a restricted access area," Richard said. "Mr. Calloway," Gerald started. "Who authorized him to be up here?" "I did, sir." He's a what? A maintenance worker? For the building?" Richard had the voice of a man who had used his voice to cut conversations short for 30 years, and it had the intended effect of making everyone present feel the need to justify themselves. "You brought a building maintenance worker to my helicopter." "Sir." "I think he may have found Gerald." Richard's voice dropped to the specific register it used when patience had fully expired. "I have spent $2.3 million. I have had people here from Sikorsky, from Airbus, from 3 different countries. I have had people here with doctorates in aerospace engineering. And you have brought me" a pause, a look at Danny that was not kind, a man with a thermos. Danny had not stood up yet. He was still crouched at the engine bay, one hand resting lightly on the access panel, looking at Richard Calloway with the same steady expression he wore when he looked at machines, calm, complete, unbothered by things that were not relevant to the problem. "And a child," Richard added, looking at Emma. "There is a child on my helipad." Emma looked up from her sketchbook. "I'm not a child," she said. "I'm 7. Richard blinked. "Emma," Danny said mildly. "Well, I'm not," Emma said, and returned to her drawing. What happened next Gerald Park would describe as the moment when Richard Calloway said the thing that was too far. He would not be wrong. Richard looked at the helicopter. He looked at the man crouched beside it. He had 11 months of frustration and $2.3 million and 47 specialists and a car service that added 47 minutes each way to his Lake Forest commute, and he pointed at his own helicopter, his $9.2 million Sikorsky S-92, and he said, "You know what? It's scrap. That's what it is. It's scrap. I've decided. I'm done. I'm calling Sikorsky tomorrow and telling them to disassemble it, because in 11 months not a single qualified person has been able to fix it, and I am not going to stand here and watch a building janitor pretend that I can fix it in 3 minutes," Danny said. The wind off the lake moved through the silence. Richard stared at him. "I'm sorry?" Danny stood up. He was not a dramatically tall man, not physically imposing, not performing anything. He just stood up and looked at Richard Calloway, the way he'd been looking at him since he came through the door completely, without theater, giving him the same assessment he gave every machine and every situation, finding the distance between what was said and what was true. "It's vapor lock," Danny said, "in the fuel intake manifold. Specific to this Sikorsky configuration, under cold start, high altitude, low ambient temperature conditions. It resolves itself in warmer conditions, which is why 47 diagnostics came back clean. The condition wasn't present when they arrived." He paused. "The fix is a manual purge of the fuel intake system, followed by a recalibration of the vapor pressure threshold in the engine management software. The purge takes 90 seconds. The recalibration takes 60. Then you start the engines, and they run." He looked at his watch. 3 minutes, 20 seconds if I'm being precise. I rounded down. Richard Calloway looked at this man. Then he looked at Gerald. Gerald's expression was the expression of a man who has been carrying a margin note for 8 months and is watching it either be vindicated or humiliate him in front of his employer. "Do it," Richard said. It was not gracious. It was not an apology for the scrap comment. It was not an acknowledgement of anything. It was the voice of a man who has run out of other options and has decided to let the outcome speak for itself. Danny nodded once. He crouched back down. He opened the engine bay access panel. He looked at Emma. "Time me," he said. Emma produced, from the pocket of her purple jacket, a small stopwatch. She carried it because her father had taught her to time things, because timing things was how you learned how long things actually took, versus how long you thought they took, which he said was one of the most useful skills a person could have. She clicked it. Danny went to work. Gerald Park watched the second hand on his own watch. He had been in aviation management for 20 years. He had worked alongside pilots, engineers, mechanics, inspectors, and specialists of every conceivable credential. He had watched people work on aircraft in hangars and on tarmacs and on rooftops and in conditions ranging from ideal to genuinely dangerous. He had never watched anyone work the way Danny Kowalski worked. It wasn't speed, exactly though it was fast. It was precision. Every movement went somewhere. Every reach found what it was reaching for without searching. He did not fumble, did not backtrack, did not make the small hesitations that mark a person working from memory, as opposed to a person working from understanding. He had opened the access panel, reached into the fuel intake manifold housing with the confidence of someone who has done this in the dark, in weather, at altitude, under conditions that did not allow for the luxury of being uncertain, and he had Gerald would later struggle to describe it to his wife, and the description he finally landed on was this. He looked like the helicopter was telling him what to do, and he was just listening. 90 seconds. The manual purge. The fuel system cleared and reset. 30 more seconds. He moved to the avionics panel. Gerald hadn't even seen him open it. The engine management software interface. Fingers on the control input, a sequence of commands that Gerald recognized the category of, but not the specifics. A recalibration value, entered with the certainty of someone who has worked out the number long before arriving. Emma's stopwatch said 2 minutes 41 seconds. Danny closed the avionics panel. He closed the engine bay access. He stood up. He looked at Richard Calloway. "Start it," he said. Richard Calloway did not move for a moment. He was a man who had built a significant portion of his life on the premise that competence was a function of credentials, that the right degree, the right firm, the right number of zeros on an invoice were reliable proxies for the right answer. He had spent 11 months operating on this premise. and had arrived at $2.3 million and 47 people, and the word scrap. And now a man in a canvas work jacket who had timed himself with his 7-year-old daughter's stopwatch was telling him to start the engines. Richard looked at the helicopter. He looked at Danny. He looked at Gerald, whose expression had moved from anxious to something that was trying not to be hopeful, because hope, after 11 months, had become a thing Gerald handled carefully. Richard walked to the cockpit. He had his pilot's license. He had flown the S-92 himself, on occasion not for long flights, just for the freedom of it, the specific pleasure of being at the controls of something that powerful. He knew the startup sequence. He ran it. The engines turned. And then, for the first time in 11 months, they caught. Both of them. Simultaneously, the Sikorsky S-92 came to life on the rooftop of Callaway Tower on a Tuesday morning in October, with the deep, authoritative sound of an engine doing exactly what it was built to do, the rotors beginning their slow turn, the instrument panel lighting up green across every system, the aircraft vibrating in the way of something that has been patient for a very long time, and is now, finally, being asked to be what it is. Gerald Park put his hand over his face. Not to cry, although the effort was present, just to have a moment inside his own head where nobody could see what 11 months looked like resolving. Emma clicked the stopwatch. 2 minutes and 58 seconds, she announced. You said 3 minutes. You were early. Danny looked at her. I rounded up, he said. You said you rounded down before. Emma, you did though. Richard Callaway shut the engines down after 2 minutes of running. He climbed out of the cockpit. He walked across the helipad and stood in front of Danny Kowalski. Danny waited. There are moments that hinge moments where a person is presented with a clear choice between the smaller version of themselves and a larger one, and the whole shape of what comes next depends on which one they reach for. Richard Callaway was not a man accustomed to these moments, because he had spent most of his adult life constructing a world in which they didn't arise. But here, on a rooftop in the Chicago wind, with his helicopter running in his ears and 11 months of failure in his chest, and a man in a work jacket standing in front of him, who had just done in 3 minutes what 47 credentialed specialists could not do in 11 months, he reached for the larger one. I called it scrap, Richard said. You did, Danny agreed. I said qualified people couldn't fix it, in a way that implied you were not. I heard you. A pause. The wind. The distant sound of the City 49 floors below. I was wrong, Richard said, about the helicopter and about you. I'm sorry. He said it plainly. Not with performance, not with the managed sincerity of a man who has taken a media training course, just directly the way direct things should be said. Danny looked at him for a moment. Accepted, he said. Richard Callaway invited them downstairs. This was unexpected enough that Gerald's eyebrows rose and didn't fully come back down for several minutes. Richard Callaway did not invite building maintenance workers to his office. He did not invite their children. He did not, as a general rule, extend hospitality to people he had just finished insulting on his own helipad. He did this. They took the elevator to 49. Emma held her stopwatch. Gerald walked slightly behind everyone, carrying the sensation of a man who has stepped into a story that doesn't match any category in his professional experience. Richard's office was what you'd expect: large, understated in the way that only money fully spent on taste produces, with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the lake. Emma walked directly to the windows and stood there looking at the water with the frank appreciation of a 7-year-old who is not yet trained to pretend that beautiful things aren't beautiful. Richard ordered coffee. He sat across from Danny. How did you know? He said. Danny told him. The service elevator in November. Phil's offhand comment. The 2 questions he'd asked and the answer he'd arrived at before the elevator reached the lobby. 11 months of passing the 47th floor window. the 47 reports that Phil had shown him in March, which he had read because he was curious. You read 47 technical reports, Richard said, in your spare time. It was a Sikorsky S-92, Danny said, as though this explained it. And for Danny Kowalski, it did. You worked on these? Black Hawks mostly, some Chinooks. The S-92 shares the fuel system architecture with the military S-92 variant, the HH-92. We had vapor lock issues with a specific unit in Kuwait in 2009. Cold night, high elevation. It took us 4 hours the first time, because nobody had seen it before in that configuration. He paused. Second time, about 3 minutes. Richard was quiet for a moment. You were in the Army. 12 years. Aviation warrant officer. Helicopter crew chief before that. Combat deployments? 2. Richard looked at him with the specific attention of a man recalibrating, taking the image he'd formed on the rooftop, the canvas jacket and the thermos, and the child with the stopwatch, and overlaying it with this information, and understanding that the image had been wrong in the way that images formed in an instant are often wrong. Why are you doing vac work? He asked. He didn't mean it the way it could be taken, not dismissively. He meant it as what it was. A genuine question about the distance between what someone is and what they're doing. Danny was quiet for a moment. My wife passed, he said, when Emma was 4. Before that, she needed care that moving around didn't allow for. He looked at his daughter, who was still at the window. I needed to be home. I needed something that let me be home. He looked back at Richard. The work is honest. I'm good at it. I don't have complaints. Richard looked at Emma at the window. He had a daughter too. She was 23 now. Lived in London. Called on Sundays. He thought about what it had cost him, over the years, to be what he was, the hours, the presence traded for progress. The specific calculation he had made 10,000 times and always landed on the same side of. He thought about a man who had made the opposite calculation and what that cost differently. I want to offer you something, Richard said. Danny's expression said, here we go. Not a favor, Richard said quickly. He'd seen the expression, had read it accurately. Not charity. A job. I have a job. A different job. Callaway Industries has an Aviation Division 3 aircraft, 2 helicopters, 1 turboprop. We have a contracted maintenance firm in Midway. They're adequate. He paused, and in the pause was the full weight of 11 months and 47 people, and the word adequate. I want someone who is more than adequate. I want the person who read 47 reports in their spare time, because the problem was interesting. I want the person who knew the answer in November and was still there in October, because he paused again, looking for the right word. Because the answer was right, Danny said quietly, whether anyone asked or not. Richard looked at him. Yes, he said, exactly that. Emma had turned from the window. She was looking at the 2 men at the table with the noticing eyes that noticed everything. Is this the part where you offer him a big job? She said. Richard looked at her. It is. And is this the part where he says he needs to think about it? Richard looked at Danny. Danny looked at Emma. Probably, Danny admitted. Emma sat down in the chair beside her father, with the air of a 7-year-old, who has decided to participate in this conversation rather than merely observe it. She put her stopwatch on the table. She looked at Richard Callaway with her mother's directness and her father's steadiness and said, Is it a good job? Like actually good? Not just money good. Good like is the work interesting? Richard Callaway, who had in the last 2 hours been surprised more times than he typically was in a given quarter, found himself surprised again. It's very interesting, he said. 3 aircraft. Different systems. Problems that don't always have obvious solutions. He paused, and the helicopter, specifically, will need regular monitoring, given what we found today. I'd want someone who knows it the way a glance at Danny the way you clearly do. Emma looked at her father. It's a Sikorsky S-92, she said, in exactly the tone her father had used, as though that explained everything. Danny put his hand over his face for a moment. When he took it away, he was almost smiling. Gerald Park found Danny in the lobby at 12:30. Danny and Emma were on their way out, Emma with her drawing kit and her stuffed elephant and her stopwatch, Danny with his thermos and his toolbox, both of them moving through the marble lobby of Callaway Tower with the particular quality of people who belong somewhere without needing the building to confirm it. Gerald stopped them. He was holding his notepad. He opened it to the margin of the page he'd been carrying for 8 months, and he showed Danny what he'd written. Vapor lock? Sikorsky, fuel system specialist? Danny looked at it. Gerald said, I was 8 months away from you and I didn't know who to call. Danny looked at him steadily. You found me, he said. Eventually. Gerald's voice had something in it that was not quite guilt, and not quite relief, the specific emotional alloy of a person who has done their best and knows it, and also knows that their best had a gap in it. If I'd asked Phil in November, you asked now, Danny said. It's fixed now. Gerald looked at the notepad, then at Danny, then at the question that had been sitting in his chest for 8 months, which was not actually a question about helicopters. How do you do that? Gerald said. Not the technical part. The you knew for 11 months. You were in this building every week. You could have said something. Danny thought about this the way he thought about everything honestly, without hurry. I was a crew chief before I was a warrant officer, he said. You know what a crew chief does? He takes care of the aircraft. That's it. Not the politics around it. Not the chain of command. Not who's asking and who isn't. Just take care of the aircraft. He looked at Gerald. I couldn't take care of the aircraft from the 41st floor, so I waited until someone gave me access and asked. He paused. You asked. Gerald nodded slowly. Also, Danny said. Phil showed me the reports. I knew what the diagnosis was. If it had been an active flight operation, if people's lives were depending on it, I would have gone straight to whoever I needed to go to. But it was a grounded aircraft. The only thing at risk was, he didn't finish the sentence. Gerald finished it for him. $2.3 million and 11 months of Richard Callaway's schedule. Right, Danny said. That's survivable. Gerald almost laughed. It came out as something between a laugh and a breath. You're going to take the job, Gerald said. It was not a question. Danny looked at Emma. Emma was looking at him with the stopwatch in her hand, and an expression that said she was ready to time whatever happened next. Yeah, Danny said. I think so. He called Richard that evening. Emma was doing homework at the kitchen table. The scrambled eggs were on the stove. The photograph of Claire was on the truck dashboard. But Danny had brought a copy inside a long time ago. It sat on the kitchen counter, near enough to be present, near enough to be part of whatever was still being built. Richard answered on the first ring, which Danny noted and appreciated. He said yes. 3 conditions: flexibility around Emma's schedule, full access to the aircraft technical documentation, and he wanted to read the maintenance history on all 3 aircraft before his first day, because he didn't like going into something without understanding what had been done and what hadn't. Richard said the documentation would be ready tomorrow. Danny said, there's one more thing. Name it. The vapor lock issue we fixed today. It's in the footnote of the Houston team's report, page 31. But there are likely at least 6 other S-92 operators in the Midwest flying aircraft with the same unresolved condition. They haven't failed yet because the conditions haven't been right, but they will. He paused. Someone should circulate an advisory. A long silence on the other end. I'll have Gerald handle it, Richard said. Make sure it gets to the operators, not just the service centers. Done. Another pause. You're not even on the payroll yet and you're it 6 helicopters, Danny said simply. And the people in them. Richard Calloway was quiet for a moment. First day is Monday, he said. Is that enough time? Monday's fine. Danny. Yeah, thank you. A pause not empty, but full of the specific content of a man who has spent 11 months being wrong in a way that mattered, and is aware of this, and is trying to say something commensurate with it. Not just for the helicopter. Danny looked at the photograph on the counter, at Emma at the table, pencil moving, focused, alive in the particular way that children are alive when they are doing something they love. At the life in the kitchen, small and solid and real. Monday, he said, and hung up. There's a number that matters in this story. Not $2.3 million, though that's a number. Not 47, though that's a number too. The number is 8. 8 months. That's how long Gerald Park carried a margin note that said vapor lock, Sikorsky fuel system specialist, without knowing that the specialist was 40 floors below him every Tuesday and Thursday. 8 months not because Gerald wasn't diligent, because he was. Not because the answer wasn't available, because it was. But because the answer was wearing a canvas work jacket, and the question was wearing a suit. And in 11 months, neither of them had been in the same room at the same time for long enough to find each other. That's what this story is actually about. Not the 3 minutes. The 3 minutes were the easy part easy, because they were the product of 12 years in the Army and 2 combat deployments, and the specific, unreplaceable education of being the person who stands between a broken machine and the lives that depend on it. The 3 minutes were what happens when you give the right person access to the right problem. The hard part was the 11 months. The hard part was Danny Kowalski, who had the answer, passing the 47th floor window every Tuesday and Thursday watching, knowing, saying nothing, because the machines he'd learned on had taught him that knowledge without access is just patience, and patience without purpose is just waiting. And waiting is what you do until the moment arrives to do something else. The hard part was a little girl with a stopwatch and a stuffed elephant named Gerald, who sat on a toolbox on a helipad 49 floors up and timed her father doing the thing he was built to do, not because anyone had discovered him, not because fate had intervened, but because Gerald Park had finally opened the right door. Danny Kowalski started Monday. On his first day, he submitted a 12-page technical review of all 3 Callaway aircraft with prioritized maintenance recommendations and a section at the end on the vapor lock advisory, which was distributed to S-92 operators across the Midwest within the week. 2 of those operators subsequently found and resolved the same condition in their own aircraft. Nobody knew how close they'd been. Emma started at a new school in the fall and immediately began teaching her classmates that timing things was one of the most useful skills they could have. She was, by general consensus, correct, and on a Tuesday in November exactly 1 year after a Sikorsky S-92 had failed to start on a rooftop, in Chicago, Danny Kowalski stood on that same rooftop and watched it lift off clean into a sky so blue it looked invented. He had a thermos of coffee. He watched it go up. He thought about Claire, the way he always did when something worked the way it was supposed to work, with gratitude, with the particular grief that has learned to live alongside joy instead of fighting it. He thought about Emma at school, timing things. He thought about 12 years of Army aviation and all the machines he'd known and all the problems he'd solved and all the dark mornings at forward operating bases when the helicopter had to fly. And it was his hands and his knowledge standing between the mission and the alternative. He thought about 8 months of a margin note. He thought about a man on a rooftop who had called something scrap, and he took a sip of his coffee. The helicopter got smaller against the blue, and Danny Kowalski smiled at it quietly, to himself, the way he did most things, and went back to work.